At one rarely discussed moment in music history, there was a dark point in the life of Elvis Presley, a time when fame no longer felt like a blessing and the stage lights became shadows pressing down on his soul. The world knew him as the king of rock and roll, an icon adored by millions. Yet behind the legend, Elvis was slowly experiencing something far more painful. He was almost abandoned by everyone around him. In the early days of his career, Elvis was a symbol of hope. He came from poverty, from a small home filled with limitations, carrying a simple dream to sing and change his family's fate. Music was his escape. The stage was where he felt alive. But when fame arrived too fast, he was never truly prepared for the price it demanded. Popularity changed everything: relationships, trust, even the way people saw him as a human being rather than a product. The bigger Elvis became, the more people surrounded him. Yet, ironically, the louder the crowd grew, the lonelier his heart felt. Many came not for who he was, but for what he represented. Genuine advice was slowly replaced by hidden interests. Those who once treated him as a talented young man now saw him as an asset, something to protect, exploit, and push beyond its limits. Elvis began losing control over his own life. Relentless performance schedules, pressure to remain flawless, and the demands of the industry drained him physically and mentally. There was no room for failure, no permission to complain. Every smile before the camera was a mask. Every applause reminded him that he was not allowed to fall apart. Inside him, exhaustion turned into anxiety, and anxiety became fear, the fear of losing everything. His personal relationships began to fracture. Old friendships faded due to distance and emotional strain. People who were once close slowly drifted away, either unable to handle the pressure of living in Elvis's orbit or feeling they no longer belonged in his tightly controlled world. For the first time in his life, Elvis felt something unfamiliar and terrifying: abandonment, even while surrounded by people. Even his family, his strongest emotional anchor, could not always understand the weight he carried. They loved him deeply, but they did not always know how to help him. Elvis often chose silence, burying his struggles so he wouldn't become a burden to those he loved. That silence slowly turned into distance, and that distance became a deep, aching loneliness. The entertainment industry that once worshipped him began to grow cold when he no longer fit its desired direction. There was pressure to change, to follow trends, to become a different version of himself. Every artistic decision was questioned. Every step outside expectations was treated as a threat. Elvis felt his own voice slipping away from his life. This was the point where Elvis nearly collapsed. Long nights were spent restless, questioning the meaning of everything he had achieved. He asked himself whether fame, wealth, and admiration were worth the crushing loneliness they demanded. There were moments when he felt the world had taken everything from him, including his freedom to simply be human. As people around him began to leave one by one, Elvis turned the blame inward. He felt he had failed to protect relationships, failed to meet expectations, failed to become the perfect figure everyone wanted. Guilt piled up, heavy and relentless, eroding his self-worth. He wasn't just physically exhausted, he was emotionally broken. Yet, in the middle of that collapse, one thing never completely abandoned him: music. Music remained the place he returned to, the only space where he could be honest without fear of judgment. Through melodies and lyrics, Elvis spoke when words failed him. Music witnessed the tears the cameras never saw. That lowest point forced him to face himself without the mask of fame. He began to realize that he had been living to fulfill other people's expectations rather than his own truth. The realization was painful, but it opened the door to change. Elvis started to understand that if he wanted to survive, he had to rediscover who he really was, not who the world demanded him to be. Slowly, he tried to rise again, even if his steps were unsteady. Not everyone returned, and not every wound healed quickly. But Elvis learned to accept that reality. He learned that loss was part of the journey, and that not everyone who leaves represents failure. Some people leave so that strength can be found within. In these moments, Elvis showed a different kind of courage, not on stage, but within himself. The courage to keep living, to keep creating, and to believe that his life still held meaning beyond the spotlight. He may have been almost abandoned by everyone, but he never fully abandoned himself. The road out of that lowest point was not instant. There were days when he fell again, when loneliness returned without warning. But each time Elvis learned something vital. His worth was not defined by who stayed or who left, but by his ability to keep moving forward, even while wounded. This story is not only about a music legend, but about a human being battling loneliness, pressure, and loss. It is about how fame can become a double-edged sword, and how true strength is often born from the deepest suffering. Elvis may have been almost abandoned by everyone, but it was at his lowest point that he rediscovered the core of who he really was. And perhaps that is his greatest legacy, not only the timeless songs, but the reminder that even when the world feels like it has walked away, there is still hope to endure, to rise, and to find the light again. As Elvis moved forward from that lowest point, the silence around him became both a burden and a teacher. Without the constant noise of approval, he was forced to listen to his own thoughts, some comforting, many painful. He realized how long he had lived reacting instead of choosing, surviving instead of truly living. Fame had trained him to perform strength even when he felt hollow. But now, stripped of reassurance, he had to confront his vulnerabilities head-on. There were moments when memories of his early years returned with sharp clarity. He remembered the simplicity of singing for the love of it before expectations weighed down every note. Back then, music was freedom. Now, it often felt like obligation. That contrast haunted him. Yet within that haunting was a quiet reminder. The passion that once saved him had not disappeared. It had merely been buried beneath fear and fatigue. Elvis began to understand that being almost abandoned had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Many relationships in his life were built around what he could provide, not who he truly was. When the energy faded, so did their presence. This realization hurt deeply, but it also freed him from illusions he had carried for years. Not everyone who walks beside you is meant to stay for the entire journey. The loneliness, though painful, created space for reflection. In that space, Elvis questioned the identity the world had imposed on him. Was he truly only a symbol, a brand, a legend? Or was he still the same young man who once believed music could heal wounds? These questions did not have immediate answers, but asking them marked the beginning of reclaiming his inner voice. He learned that strength does not always announce itself through confidence or control. Sometimes strength appears quietly, in choosing to keep going, in admitting fear, in accepting that not every battle can be won publicly. Elvis's resilience during this time was not loud or glamorous. It was internal, fragile, and deeply human. There were days when doubt returned relentlessly. On those days, he questioned whether he still mattered, whether the world would remember him if he stopped trying to prove his worth. Yet even in doubt, he continued, not because he felt fearless, but because stopping felt worse than moving forward in pain. Persistence became his form of defiance. Gradually, Elvis redefined what survival meant to him. It was no longer about maintaining an image or pleasing an audience. It was about preserving his soul. He began to value moments of authenticity, however small, moments where he could breathe without expectation, where music felt like expression again rather than performance. The scars of abandonment did not disappear. They became part of him, shaping his perspective and deepening his emotional range. But instead of weakening him, those scars gave his voice new weight. When he sang, there was more than talent. There was experience, loss, and truth. Audiences may not have known the full story, but they felt the difference. Elvis's journey through abandonment reminds us that even icons are not immune to isolation. Success does not protect the heart from loneliness, and admiration does not guarantee understanding. Yet his story also proves that collapse does not have to be the end. Sometimes it is the beginning of clarity. In facing near total abandonment, Elvis confronted the one presence that mattered most: himself. He learned that self-worth cannot be borrowed from applause or loyalty from others. It must be built internally, patiently, often painfully. This lesson did not erase his struggles, but it gave them meaning. By the time he began to rise again, Elvis was not the same man who had fallen. He carried less illusion and more awareness. He knew that being loved by millions did not replace being understood by a few, and he accepted that some paths are walked alone, not as punishment, but as preparation. His lowest point became a quiet turning point, not because everything suddenly improved, but because he stopped running from his truth. He stood in it, acknowledged it, and chose to continue despite it. That choice, repeated daily, was his greatest act of courage. In the end, the story of Elvis being almost abandoned by everyone is not simply a tragedy. It is a reflection of how fragile success can be, and how resilient the human spirit must become to survive it. It reminds us that even when the world steps back, there is still power in staying. And perhaps that is why his story endures, not only because of the music he left behind, but because within his struggle lies a universal truth. Being abandoned can break you, but it can also strip life down to what truly matters, and from there, teach you how to stand again.